Welcome, everybody. Hi, this is a panel discussion titled Access for All, Internet in Service of the Society. Thank you very much for joining from wherever you are. We are all in a digital age, which very much allows for people from all over the world to join in and listen into events and discussions. But it's also in competition with everything else that people might be doing at the same point of time. So thank you for making it here. We are talking about access here, so we do need to acknowledge upfront some of the challenges that people experience in accessing benefits of the internet. This specific panel will discuss the various dimensions of access, potential solutions, and also talk a little bit about how Sri Lanka and India can collaborate more fruitfully on this issue. This context, and I'm sure very many of you are familiar with it, is that societies all over the world are increasingly reliant on technology for their home, work, and social lives. This is particularly increased in the last year, given the need for social distancing. Internet-enabled technologies have the potential to democratize access and allow innovators to disrupt and find better ways to serve more people. And while the gains of technology are manifold, there is increasingly a reliance on technology that has a dark side, which is that the fault lines are drawn around access. Research from various contexts is showing that persons with disabilities, women, the elderly, and those from backward social communities tend to be excluded from digital economies and their gains. I'm joined by four amazing people from Sri Lanka and India who've been thinking about digital technology, its impact, and its usefulness in their work from several dimensions. This kind of cross-national conversation is critical, especially in these times. It will hopefully enable us to learn from each other and address breakdowns sooner with lower costs. I am Sariu and I run the Apti Institute, which is a research institution interested in the intersection of technology and society. At Apti, we think about access a lot. We think about empowerment in a digital economy as coming from being able to navigate both offline barriers as well as online ones, to have equitable, free, and fair access to technology as citizens. To research and develop solutions, we have established a first mile lab within Apti. This works in tandem with our other research efforts, including the Data Economy Lab, where we think about questions of data governance. For this discussion, I'm joined by four people, and I'm going to quickly introduce them before we jump into the meat of the discussion. I request the panelists to say hello when I say their names. First, Manik Gunaratne is the manager, Specialized Training and Disability Resource Center at the Employers Federation of Ceylon. She has promoted inclusive economic development in all corners of Sri Lanka, creating long-term sustainable employment and livelihoods for persons with disabilities. Manik's work on disability rights has been recognized in Sri Lanka and beyond. Hello, Manik.
Hello.
Natasha
Good
Joshi.
afternoon, everyone.
Hi. Natasha Joshi is an associate director at the Nilekani Philanthropies. She comes with previous experience in the education sector, where she has worked on education programs, policy and governance and financing for organizations like UNICEF, Niti Aayog, which is India's planning commission, and more recently, the Tata Trust. Hi, Natasha.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
Gayani Hurule is research manager at Learn Asia, where she researches digital development, policy, and regulation. She has engaged in external consulting for two government agencies in Sri Lanka, including the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure and Information Technology, where she contributed towards the drafting of Sri Lanka's national digital policy for 2020 to 2025. Hi, Gayani.
Thanks for having me.
And then we're joined by Prashant Premakumar, who is the CEO of Agritmix, which is an agri-fintech startup focusing on digitizing and enriching the agriculture value chain, and is especially focused on providing digital solutions among the rural farming population and taking technology to the grassroots.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me.
I can't think of a better group of people to discuss the questions that we're trying to tackle today. But very quickly, before we jump into the discussion, a quick note on how this will proceed. We'll have a discussion for about 40 minutes or so, and I encourage attendees to post any questions on the chat. They will be relayed to us. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for an open discussion. So please post your questions as we go along, and I will organize them and directed towards the panelists. So just to kick this off, I'd love to start by talking a little bit more about this question of access itself. And I'd love for Manik and Gayani to jump in here. But what is research telling us about access, both from the context of Sri Lanka and as well as what you're seeing in the work that you're doing? Manik first and then Gayani after. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. When it's come to accessibility, what is accessibility? The thing is now, for persons with, especially we'll talk about accessibility for people with disabilities because it says internet for all. Internet is for everyone. To give you a small experience, just close your eyes for 10 seconds, just 10 seconds. And that's my world. Just imagine being in that world, all vision impaired persons access the internet. So you can now realize, all of you who have sight, who have vision, how difficult it is to browse the internet. Right, now open your eyes. And at the same time, if I use sign language, like say, this is good afternoon. And if I use sign language, you will not understand anything what I'm saying today. So being in those positions, because it's internet for all, we have to access the internet. So therefore, internet accessibility is very important. Why internet is not accessible? Because it's not according to standards. If you follow the W3C standards of internet, then all the website and internet will be accessible for people with disabilities. And the most important thing is at policy level, people who are making decisions at the digital technology must include people with disabilities in their forums or committees. Then only the best accessibility features will come. So if I talk a little about accessibility, websites, if they are not according to the international standards or guidelines, then we cannot access the website, because we as people with disabilities, we have vision impaired persons, we use the screen reader to surf the internet, use the internet. So it has to be accessible with the screen reader. Partially sighted people access the internet using a screen magnifier. So it should be accessible with the screen magnifier, and also with sign language interpretation. Then only we as people with disabilities can access the internet. And also when there are a lot of graphics and when the graphics are not labeled, and also if there are in videos and audios, if the audio description is not given, and especially for videos and audios, if the sign language interpretation and captioning is not available, we are not able to access the internet. So especially graphics should be labeled, picture descriptions should be provided. And I will talk a little about Sri Lankan context, because in Sri Lanka we have two local languages, the Sinhala and in Tamil. So the web contents should be in Unicode fonts with the appropriate fonts, so that people with disabilities in the very grassroots level access through local language, and internet connectivity also should be there. The list is huge, so while the discussion is going on, I will explain. So those are the main barriers we have, and those are the simple accessibility features that you as people with non-disability should consider.
Thank you for that, Manik. There is in the design, in a certain way, an ableist assumption that everybody comes from the same starting point, and to the point that you made, that's not necessarily true. Gayani, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about, to complicate this idea of disability and access as well, particularly from the research perspective.
Right. I mean, there are challenges to access for multiple groups of people. And often when we think about challenges to access, it's multifold and it changes from person to person, from different types of demographic groups. But there are a couple of base things that are applicable to the population more generally, right? So we'll talk about persons with disability and certain types of groups later, but the broader sort of questions also come in. So there are issues around coverage, there are issues around quality of service, which is applicable to anyone. And we've seen this particularly during the COVID-19 crisis, where even if there was coverage in certain areas, the quality of service was so abysmal that so many people couldn't get online. There are questions of affordability, both in terms of, say, devices and data. And there's a lot of literature to show that Sri Lanka's level of internet is less than proportional to its level of affordability. So that's definitely something to think about. And it will change from group to group as well. So if you find that there are certain groups that are low income, the internet becomes less accessible to them from that sort of perspective. There are also other things to consider, like skills and content. So like Manik mentioned, to use, or for persons with disability to use the internet, they need to be able to use so many more different types of features on their phones. So the skill gap there really needs to be bridged to get people online. And certainly in terms of content, and that's relevant, say, from a PW perspective, but also in like a local language perspective. So in Sri Lanka, you'll find that English literacy is not super high. So then there is a need to kind of get people like local language content to get people online. And there's a lot more to get into, but I'll stop there so that we can continue the discussion.
Thank you. There's several threads in both the points that you and Manik made that I'd love to pick up on over the course of this conversation. But turning things around a little bit to you, Natasha, why should we care about access? And we see this in the work in India as well. Just like Sri Lanka, there are very many groups that experience breakdowns with respect to access and to varying degrees. And the sort of boundaries of marginalization are changing as well. Why should we care? Why should we care as the state? Why should we care as civil society actors? And how may we do that?
Thanks, Aryu. I think the why is it has become, technology and digital access is a huge enabler, and I think that it is just even from a human rights perspective, it is imperative that that enablement be provided to everybody and not just some. And I think in particular, as we've seen in many instances with technology, that it has the ability to amplify existing inequities, gaps, as well as advantages and disadvantages. So given that we're already operating in a society where the haves and have-nots have a certain cleavage, if we don't focus on equitable access, that cleavage of provisions, entitlements, as well as overall well-being will just continue to expand. And I think that that is something to be really aware of, that technology access has to be a prerequisite when it comes to all the innovations of technology. So I think the why is fairly clear. I think the how is really complicated because there are three main challenges that one looks at. One is the challenge of infrastructure, the other is the challenge of innovation, and the third is the challenge of intermediaries. So with infrastructure, I think even Manik and Gayani sort of pointed to the fact that there are design aspects, there are broadband issues, there are cost affordability features that go into whether everybody is able to access the infrastructure. But then there's also the innovation piece, where there are ways to circumvent infrastructural short limitations. And I just want to sort of give one example here, which I've always found very innovative. That is actually an Indian government example, where the government of India and the Ministry of Railways actually does it, where it has rail Wi-Fi. So there are some lines that have the internet within the railway coaches. But there was also an additional innovation where there were certain very, very remote communities through which there was no land connectivity possible. So the government has looked at increasing the speed and bandwidth of the internet of the railway coaches that are crossing those remote hamlets, so that people on the peripheries of those railway tracks can come and access internet at that point. So in some sense, you're thinking of portability in a very different way. So you have to be very creative when it comes to access and somewhat marry your kind of low resource environments with a lot of creativity and a lot of imagination. And the third point was really just around intermediaries. And we feel like that's also a really big piece, but I'd love to sort of maybe dive into that a little bit, further into the conversation.
Right. Thank you. This it's a very interesting frame in which to think about why and how to care about access. But I'd like to turn to you, Prashant, a little bit to talk about both the why and the how. Like, why should we care about access from the market perspective, being, as you are a startup, and how can sort of organizations do that? And to address some of the questions that both Gayani and Manik raised around the challenges of access, particularly in the context of Sri Lanka. So over to you,
Yeah,
Prashant.
sure. I think the challenge around these access issue, I think Gayani and Natasha both spoke extensively. I think it's to do with primarily to do with infrastructure. Us being from the startup community, we are looking at all innovative solutions or the best solutions that we can provide for this marginalized or the rural population. For our startup, for example, we work significantly with the rural farmer base. But the key challenge that we're having is with no network coverage, our scope of solution is quite limited. We are not able to give them interactive live solutions. Then it becomes an offline solution, which gives a lot of limitation. We won't be able to give them interactive or real-time solutions, even for digital money, etc. So this same infrastructure challenge now then passes on for the farmers' penetration as well. So if you look at the smartphone penetration in our country, especially among the rural population, is less than 5%. The penetration of internet itself is quite limited. So a population that is not really using internet, how do we bring them a solution, an internet-driven solution, a digital solution? This is where most of the bulk of the startup or the tech world in Sri Lanka, or the tech ecosystem, is also finding it very challenging. How do we solve this? Yes, I think the solutions has to come from these the district governments or district local bodies, the local corporates, the local employers. They need to start pushing for it. They need to enable themselves digitally, first of all, in order to pass that benefit to the workers or those whose livelihoods is depending on their performance. So I think primarily the root cause, I think, for the tech ecosystem being so limited when it comes to taking these technologies, taking innovations to these rural populations or this marginalized backward population, is to do with the infrastructure. And once that we can find solutions for that, then we can systematically bring in technology and improve their adaptability and penetration as well.
Thank you for that. I'm sort of hearing two strands, right? There's the whole infrastructural issue around lack of access to the internet, lack of access to devices. And then there's a set of issues around the design of technologies, applications, and interfaces themselves, which is what Manik referred to. And I think both Natasha and Gayani alluded to them. Manik, I'd love to sort of switch tracks and start talking about how can we respond to these challenges. Very many of these play out in different ways across both Sri Lanka and India. And how can we think about both from the design perspective as well as from the program perspective, given the work that you've done with the Employers Federation about solving some of these gaps?
Yes, to solve some of these gaps, the Employers Federation of Ceylon Specialized Training and Disability Resource Center, together with the Internet Society Sri Lanka chapter, we implemented a project called Beyond the Reach, to reach people who others think that cannot be reached. This was implemented in all parts of the country, where first component was we train people with disabilities how to use the internet to gather information they require, because that is important, because they don't get the information they want in accessible formats. Then we also, because we go to the grassroots level, because our training centers are in Colombo, and so people from the very grassroots level are not able to come to Colombo. So this is done through the mobile lab concept, where we have the laptops and we create an internet facility and we create a mobile lab in rural areas, and we train people with disabilities from that area how to surf the internet and gather the information they want. And at the same time, we train developers on accessibility, because they are the ones who are developing websites, and so that the websites they develop will be accessible and all people with disabilities can access the internet. And at the same time, we sensitize the government authorities, because their website should be accessible, because most of the people using the local languages access the websites and they gather the information they want. So those are the main things, when it comes to accessibility, to reach out programs that we do. on internet, because it's important, because and also we train them on technology, how to use assistive devices. For people with disabilities, they cannot use the devices, they use the devices that you as people with non-disabilities use, but sometimes the special softwares are installed. These softwares are very expensive, so we have to give them in a subsidized rate, or provide them with this software. And also the technology, the devices. The devices for us to use is very expensive. So the government should at least give them in a standardized rate, so that people with disabilities can use the internet and technology to be equally capable as people with not yet with a disability. I'm using this word not yet with a disability because you never know when a person can be a person with a disability. So it's internet for all. The concept should be a reality. So those are the things that we have implemented, and still we are training people with disabilities on technology and assistive devices. And this we taught it long time ago. We have the e-learning facilities. When when COVID-19 pandemic, and when the country was locked down, all these trainings on internet and are using devices were very useful. So we thought about this. We never thought of COVID-19 pandemic, but we thought of a similar situation, and we train people with disabilities on these areas.
Thanks, Manik. That is very interesting to hear, that the program that you all have adopted is multi-layered, in the sense that it speaks not just to training persons with disabilities, but also looks to training developers, working with an offline program like the mobile lab that you mentioned. So this is all very significant, and in some ways, talks to some of the points that Prashant, Gaini, and Natasha have made. I'm very interested to pick up on the thread that you mentioned around sensitizing government, and also the conversation around policy, and steer the conversation to Gayani a little bit. If you could talk about the policy perspective here, because the engagement of the government in a certain way, and all of the panelists have spoken about it, is very important in this, in thinking about access. And also it goes to the legal framework within which countries operate. So access is not just sort of a functional good, but something that is necessary, or almost like a moral normative, in a moral normative way. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about the policy perspective, and also address some of what Manik raised around sensitizing the government.
Definitely, Sarayu, and I definitely agree that policymakers need to be cognizant about issues in inclusion. That's really the first step. And without really being aware and being kind of internalizing that, it's really difficult to make progress. And I remember when we were drafting this national digital policy, which unfortunately isn't being used today, inclusion was a principle that we included in the policy because we thought it was something that we needed to think about. Now, it's important that policies, when trying to come up with the policies, that it's based on evidence. And that's something that we at Learnage really do push on. Because even if we find that there is a gender gap, we need to go and find the real reason behind the gender gap, right? So it could be due to a factor such as low labor force participation, which is something that we've seen through our research, but it also could be due to like a gender stereotype, and perhaps it could be due to both of these. So if we're trying to solve the problem, we need to really get to the root cause and figure out what is causing it. So, remedial programs can be targeted that way. And then in terms of coming up with policy solutions and programs, we encourage stakeholder consultations, doing pilot tests, doing beta tests to make sure that once you come up with the programs, that it's something that actually can be broad-based later on. And something that I'll just touch on from a policy perspective is that it's always good to have policies on paper. It's a good reminder, and it's a good guide to people in kind of moving forward. But implementation is also really the key. So we need to focus on sustained implementation as we go on.
Right. No, thank you. This is something that resonates in the conversations here in India as well. The need to focus on sustained implementation, or also think about a lot of these questions upfront and try to understand why they occur rather than treating the symptom in a certain way. So absolutely resonates. Natasha, I'd like to steer the conversation to you a little bit to talk a little bit about what governance can do. And this is both from the perspective of policy, but also at organization level. So what could informal governance mechanisms do? What could organizations do to embed some of this thinking and some of this value system within the way they work?
Sure. Um, I actually want to connect with something Gayani left off with, which is the whole idea of implementation. And I think that what government can do in terms of enabling better implementation is to devolve power closer to the field and to the ground. So one of the issues, whether it is disability or any of the other, challenges that we sort of work with, is that a lot of all the way from procurement to reporting is highly centralized. And if things continue in that highly centralized manner, it becomes very difficult for communities, of course, to take any ownership, to have any agency or any power through which they can solve their own problems. And B, even the appointed administrators who are closest to the problem and who really do understand the dynamic needs of the situation aren't able to respond. So I'm saying that, that's so power devolution is one big part, and creating. The other part, of course, is in being able to create nodes of access and problem solving. So what one of the other things we've seen as effective, and this sort of now I'm extending my point on intermediaries, is that there is a layer within communities, whether it is civil society organizations, NGOs, or even cadres of political parties. But there's always a layer within the community that is able to kind of bridge the gap between service provision from the government side and the needs of the community. So somewhere sort of, making that layer a bit accountable and also empowering that layer at the same time is one method for when it comes to governance and creating a little better access. On the let's say on the nonprofit side or on the CSO side, we have found three sort of interesting perspectives. But this is, again, I just want to caveat this, that this is entirely from our experience of working with some of the civic tech organizations we support, is that there are sort of, three kind of things that are very enabling when it comes to solutioning at the field level. One is actually micro data and small data, as we call it. So small data versus big data. I think that the kind of very dynamic, live, small data is something that helps the implementation process become better and better. So it becomes a feedback mechanism. So if you're able to, have that ability to capture that data and that feedback from the field as you're implementing, it really improves implementation. The second is that having maybe some focused and fewer deep connections is sometimes more fruitful than having a very vast but shallow network of players. So that's the other thing that we've heard from the field, that it really helps in terms of building alliances and again, sort of really embedding solutions. And of course, last is the power of champions. I think there's no getting around that. And, even Manik sort of talked about, even when we train anybody, you always need some early adopters, you need your champions, and you should, we have seen that there is benefit in building for those champions in that sense. So yeah.
Right. Thank you, Natasha. Absolutely. I mean, I can't disagree, I guess, but it resonates again, I think, with the points the panelists have been making, as well as some of the research that we are also seeing around this question, around how empowering that intermediary layer, being close to the ground where some of these challenges occur, is actually critical. I'd love to also talk a little bit more about, the scope of thinking about access in a certain way. It's very tempting for one to assume that way in which people address access across the ecosystem, whether it's the government, whether it's market actors or civil society, that the motivations are the same. But that's not necessarily the case, as very, as all of you all have sort of brought up in the points you've made. I'd love to sort of bring the conversation to Prashant a little bit to talk about, what market actors can do, like what is their interest, what is their incentive in a certain way, and how might they be able to think about access more creatively and in a broad-based way.
Sure. I think from a market actor's perspective, I would put it in two categories. One is the employers or those who are going to transmit the solutions. The other aspect is the technology community or the startup community. I believe the startups is very key. Startups and the tech companies are absolutely crucial. They become the channel to take this equitable or democratized internet solutions to the rural populations, as well as those who have marginalized access to it. They are the ones, the tech community or the startup community are the ones who can think of innovative solutions, who can think of ideas to solve these problems, and who can then convince the users. The users can be employers, or it can be the end users. Could be a different community population altogether. But in order to encourage the startup community, they need to be incentivized, or they need to be provided grants, and this is where the government or other organizations, development communities can really step in, because once the infrastructure or problem is solved, or without being solved even, in order to bring innovative solutions, the tech community has to really come up, and that the startups play a critical role. Even us, we always constantly think of how do we work with these limitations. It can be infrastructure limitations, access limitations, education limitations. How do we still take technology to these grassroots? Some of the things, that innovative things that we are currently doing and what we have done so far is taking technology to the plantation sector. Sri Lankan plantation sector is a very backward community with still flowing 150-year-old mechanisms when it comes to their day-to-day livelihoods. So we're trying to bring them in, digitalize provide them digital profiles, giving them a digital money access. So when us and several other startups are also looking at such solutions, but the end user is not going to be the paying customer. So this is where we need the government, or we need the development community support to incentivize us, or to give us some sort of support in order to constantly look at this solution, because the customer is not going to start paying immediately. So, but if we don't get that support, then who's going to look at technology innovation for this population? This is something very critical. Second aspect is, as I said, the employers or the larger corporates, regional plantation companies, factories. They need to look at how they can digitally enable themselves, empower themselves, and the ecosystem that depend on them. If you look at Sri Lanka, almost 30% or 1/3 of the community is agri-dependent or agribusiness dependent, or based or either farmers or agriculture workers. So these companies have to start really looking at how they can digitally empower those who are dependent on their incomes, and those who are dependent on their relationships. So I think it's to do with the employers, the market, the private sector, and even the development organizations, NGOs, all have to come together to see how they can, in unison, create this ecosystem more sustainable.
Right. I'd like to see if, Gaini, if you wanted to jump in on this question as well, given the work that you've done around the digital policy.
Right. So I think I'd like to echo what Prashant said, and fully am in agreement. And I think the COVID crisis has shifted my thinking a little bit on this, because something that I was of the viewpoint of is that the role of government would ideally be to create this conducive environment with appropriate systems, checks and balances, in which the private sector and other kind of sectors can operate. But I've also I acknowledge that we can't have blanket rules on these, and often it depends on things like urgency and what's at stake. So if you take the COVID-19 crisis, you found that people had to rely on the internet to get their kids to school and keep people in education. And if they didn't have access to the internet, they would have significant learning loss. And then we've seen evidence coming up that people are actually dropping out of school. So that's really long-term implications, which could feed into so many other parts of human life. So when the stakes are so high, then there is certainly a case for government to step in Ideally, this would be with in partnership with other sectors like the private sector, civil society, and so on, like Prashant mentioned. But certainly, there is a case for government to play a larger role than what I would have thought of earlier. And we've seen this certainly in the rollout of telecom infrastructure, with countries like even Sri Lanka using their telecom development fund, in which they've accumulated funds over time from private sector and then are using that to push it out through this Gamta Nivedana program to roll out telecom infrastructure. So that's an area in which you can see that the government coming in is likely leading to better solutions than if they didn't, because the private sector may have pushed that out, but possibly not at the same pace.
Right. Thank you very much for that. That is a shift in thinking that we have seen in some other conversations as well. The shift from providing a conducive atmosphere within which actors can work to thinking about the more active role that governments can play. So absolutely hear that conversation. Natasha, did you want to jump in here as well to respond to what the roles of the different actors might be, thinking about it as government, private sector and civil society, and the roles that these different organizations could play, different stakeholders could play?
Sure, sure. So the way the ideal, I suppose, is to have a kind of a balance and a coordination between all of these three stakeholders. And naturally, we feel like what's interesting to observe is that the incentives of all three stakeholders overlap at some points and then diverge at other points. So for government, it's a combination of sort of constitutional rights, but at the same time, cost effectiveness at the level of the. But what I was saying was that we have governments which have their own incentives and their own criteria for what their fiduciary responsibility is, and then you have the market system, and then there's civil society. I think the role we, from the perspective that I'm speaking from, are naturally sort of, we root a lot of our work in civil society and see the power of civil society to sort of ground truth a lot of solutions. So they become a huge sort of they become the most important stakeholder in terms of being able to both enable solutions and also feed back to the best solutions. And in doing so, we want, we hope that civil society itself can be enabled. But I definitely agree with what Kayani and also Prashant said, that there's a clear agility and innovation and zeal that the private sector brings to all of this. And if we look at a lot of, at least in India, if we look at a lot of innovations that went to scale eventually or that were taken up by government, they all sort of started out as smaller innovations by the private side. So I think that balance is important. I think famously in India, for sure, that we say that business needs to thrive or has been thriving despite the government and not because of it. So I think there is a huge role for the government to play to become maybe more of a regulator, less of a sort of implementer, but also a gentle regulator, a more enabling regulator. So there are these conversations which are underway, but I think that each player brings something very vital to the mix.
Absolutely. And, I'd love to take that conversation to you, Manik, to both think about this broader conversation about the roles of different actors, particularly private players, given your work with the Employers Federation, but also think about how some of these ideas may be embedded from the beginning. I think we sort of talked about it a little bit. And you also brought it up in the work you mentioned on design, but would love to have your thoughts as well on this broader question of the different roles.
Yes, the different roles when it comes to people with disabilities at policy level, I think when it's come to digital inclusion, they should include people with disabilities in the decision making process, because it says nothing about us without us. So nobody can take decisions on behalf of people with disabilities, because the digital accessibility, the best people to talk about digital accessibility for people with disabilities, it's us. And on the other hand, when it comes to employers at policy level, so the employers also should make, websites accessible, digital accessibility. So I think at policy level, at government level, they should provide maybe tax concessions, other concessions for the employers, give them the knowledge, the guidelines, the proper guidelines, the standards, so that the private sector, the employers can implement these things so that the larger audience, the employees can benefit from all these implementation. Implementation is very important because sometimes there are pilot projects, but it's stopped halfway, or some other due to other reason, it's not in continuity. Continuity is very important, and coverage, internet coverage, accessibility, all those should be taken into consideration. And I am saying it again, when it's come to accessibility for people with disabilities, whoever is taking decisions should include people with disabilities. And because I'm really happy for this forum that you all included a person with a disability to talk about access persons with disability. It's proper inclusion is there. You have started the right way, so it's a matter of taking it forward.
Thank you for that. I think that is something that is so critical. The idea that governance, decision making, design are all processes that talk to everybody right from the very beginning. So that is very, very. Just in terms of a time check, we are looking to bring questions as well from the audience. But before we sort of go towards that, I'd love to hear from all the panelists about how sort of, given that this is a conversation across two countries, how we may learn from each other better, how may we continue this conversation. I think that this is an opportunity for us to reflect on the common challenges and the common aspirations. So we'd love to sort of in turn hear from all of y'all. I'll just sort of, just to make this easier, Manik, if you could go first, that would be great.
Right. Because the concept internet is, I told you that internet is for all, because we as people with disabilities, it's very important because when it comes, because what can I say, the anyway we are in a, because due to COVID-19, I will start from there. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, there were lockdown situations, right? Anyway, for people with disabilities, it's a lockdown situation. But when the whole world is locked down, we are double locked up, right? And if we are not empowered to use the internet, the technology, the digital accessibility, then we are, tripled marginalized. So it's important that all of us have to get together. It's not a thing that only people with disabilities can do. People with disabilities, people with non-disabilities, we all we should get together. The thing is, people with disabilities, we have the will, we have the knowledge, but we don't have the power to implement most of the things. Even the civil society, the government, they have the power, but they must improve the will and the knowledge. So I must say, because when it's come to implementation, the will should be there, the knowledge should be there, and the power. If all these things get together, I think we can make a disabled friendly environment with dignity and justice for everyone.
Thank you for that, Gayani. Thank you for that, Manik. Sorry. Prashant, I'd love to hear from you about how we may continue this conversation. I think Manik made very important points about, coming together, and I'd love to see how you respond to that as well.
I think when it comes to learning between the two countries, what you primarily want to focus on is, I think there is a lot to learn from India, actually. Sri Lanka, to be honest, when it comes to technology adaptation, we are slightly or somewhat behind India. I feel the mobile smartphone penetration, internet penetration, even among mobile money penetration, etc. India is way ahead, especially with Paytm and similar solutions being available in the market. Sri Lanka is playing a catch-up game. And there is a lot that we can learn from the frameworks that the India adapted, especially when it comes to their rural populations and how they took internet services to these rural populations. So there is a lot of learning, and that's currently happening. There is a lot of learning and a lot of adaptations of the frameworks that how India was successful, and we need to bring that. First of all, the infrastructure accessibility to Sri Lanka, and then of course the internet and other service penetrations into Sri Lanka. So there's a lot to, more than to collaborate, there's a lot to learn and follow similar mechanisms in order to bring the same digital benefits or even better benefits to the Sri Lankan population for their specific challenges. And I think the Sri Lankan tech communities, the government bodies and the private community, everyone has to come together in order to make sure that our population, the marginalized population especially, get the same benefits.
Right. Thank you for that, Prashant. Thank you. Gayani, if you wanted to jump in as well.
Sure. So, I mean, I think Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka does better than India in certain things, just in terms of, say, internet use and urban-rural gaps and whatnot, but that could just be a function of Sri Lanka being a high-income country, and often we see that higher levels of education and a higher income are often associated with higher levels of internet use. However, Sri Lanka, I think, has a lot to learn from India in terms of a regulation and policy perspective. So if you look at, say, India's performance on the ITU's regulatory tracker, India and Pakistan are one of the top performers in South Asia, whereas Sri Lanka and Maldives are at the bottom. So clearly there is something to learn from that sort of perspective. And just from my perspective, and Sarah, you and Natasha, you may want to jump in here, but India seems to be quite bold in its policy and regulatory decisions in this sort of space. So I'm thinking the net neutrality rules, I'm talking about the equalization levy. They've been quite ahead of the curve and not really waiting sometimes for global consensus, which could be good or bad. But the boldness is something that we definitely have to acknowledge, and Sri Lanka can certainly see how things pan out in India based on these and learn from that. And something that just very quickly I'll mention that I've noticed that even in terms of the net neutrality regulations, it came in fairly early, but there have been a number of consultation papers that have come in, in I think a couple in 2020 as well, even though the initial consultation paper came out in 2015. So there's clearly a move to kind of reiterate, revamp, and relearn, and that's something that maybe Sri Lanka can learn from as well.
Right. Thank you. I think within India, at least, we're given to complain about everything that government does. So it's hard to see it. And I think that that's what this perspective brings, which is to see the things that different countries have done better and sort of build from there. Natasha, if you also wanted to jump in on this, I'd love to hear your response.
Sure. Just, a simple point that I think that the future, in addition to expansion of technology, is really governments trying to understand what to do with data and data security, data privacy, the rights of data. So I think that has to be a global conversation, actually. It's more than India and Sri Lanka. It has to be a regional conversation. It has to be a global conversation, because data and internet flows everywhere. So I think in that sense, these kinds of convenings and these kinds of conversations, cross-border dialogues, are really, really vital. And I think both sides learn quite a bit from that. And I think we've talked a little bit about how we don't know where data regulation necessarily will go in each country or in each region. But I think it's definitely the next conversation that will become quite big. So in that sense, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of the questions from the audience, I think the panel has sort of folded in very many of the questions already. Most of them pertain to the role, scope of government, scope of market, and the role civil society actors could play. So I think we can wrap now, unless anybody wanted to have a moment to say something in conclusion. Right. So thank you very much for your time. I think we've heard some wonderful points about the need for all of us to come together for decision making around technology, both technology policy as well as the design, to be inclusive from the beginning in order to sort of address these questions of access breakdowns that might occur at a later point of time. We've also talked a little bit about the role of the government in reducing the costs for access to allow market actors and civil society actors to innovate upon it, as well as creating enabling policy frameworks. I also thought I heard a lot from across the panel around the need for community organizations for continuing to work at the interface of technology and the broader societies and communities that they serve, which is again something critical to think about in terms of understanding access, because there's knowledge, there's skills, there's tools, there's an intuitive sense of data that they bring to the table in a certain way to address some of these gaps. And of course, I feel like we heard it across. There's a need for a global conversation. There's a need for countries and organizations to continue to talk to each other around what we might do better and reduce some of these gaps around breakdowns and access. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the audience as well. I know this is a lunch graveyard hour, so thanks for the patience, and thanks to the organizing teams at FITIS, as well as anybody who's involved. Thank you very much.